All right, let's dive into one of the most important and honestly strangest conflicts of the 20th century, the Cold War. We're going to treat this as your personal study guide, breaking down how this massive clash of ideas and power basically set the stage for the world we live in right now.
So here's the big question, right? It's the one that kicks off this whole story. How did the United States and the Soviet Union go from fighting on the same side in World War II to becoming bitter, mortal enemies? I mean, the ink was barely dry on Germany's surrender, and the alliance was already falling apart. That's what we're going to figure out.
You know, at the very core of this whole thing were two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. It was like they were running on different operating systems. The US was all about democracy and capitalism, individual rights, free enterprise. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was running on communism, a one-party state, total government control of the economy. These weren't just minor disagreements, they were fundamentally incompatible, and each side was absolutely convinced their system was the future.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at where all the bad blood came from. Then we'll get into America's main strategy, called containment. After that, the high-stakes race for supremacy. Then we'll see how the whole world became a global chessboard. And finally, we'll cover the big finale, the thaw and collapse.
So, let's start at the very beginning, the end of World War II. This should have been a time of celebration and unity, but instead, it planted the seeds for decades of suspicion and fear between the world's two new superpowers.
And here's the thing, the mistrust wasn't a one-way street, not at all. From the American side, there was this deep-seated fear of communism and of Joseph Stalin, who was, let's be honest, a brutal dictator. But the Soviets had their own list of grievances. They were bitter that the US waited so long to jump into World War II, a delay they felt cost them millions of lives. And then, after the war, when the Soviets started taking over Eastern Europe, American fears just went through the roof. It all boiled down to this thick, suffocating cloud of mutual distrust. And that brings us to the name itself, Cold War. Why cold? Well, because the two heavyweights, the US and the USSR, never actually went to war directly with each other. There were no major battles between American and Soviet armies. Instead, they fought through threats, through spying, and by backing opposite sides in other countries' wars.
So the US is watching the Soviets expand their influence, and they're thinking, we have to do something. They needed a new playbook for foreign policy, and the one they came up with would basically dictate their every move for the next 40 years.
And that playbook was called containment. The name says it all, really. The idea wasn't to go in and destroy the Soviet Union, it was to contain communism, to build a wall around it, so to speak, and stop it from spreading anywhere else. The key words here were long-term, patient but firm. It was about drawing a line and daring the Soviets to cross it.
If you want to understand the thinking behind containment, you have to read this quote. It's from a super influential memo called The Long Telegram, written by a US diplomat named George Kennan. He basically said, look, these guys are fanatics. They truly believe they can't peacefully coexist with us, so our only option is to contain them. This telegram was a huge deal. It basically became the foundation of US policy.
Now, this strategy of just containing the enemy quickly ramped up into something way more intense. It led to the most dramatic and honestly, the most terrifying parts of the Cold War, the race to build bigger bombs and the race to conquer space.
Okay, here's the key date for your notes, 1949. This changed everything. See, for 4 years after World War II, America was the only country with the atomic bomb. It was their ultimate trump card. But in 1949, the Soviets tested their own. Suddenly, the game was a lot more dangerous. The nuclear arms race was on.
And this kicked off a terrifying cycle of one-upsmanship. The Soviets get the A-bomb? Okay, America develops the even more powerful H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb. And of course, as soon as the US has it, the Soviets race to build their own. It was a constant back and forth, with each side stockpiling enough weapons to destroy the world many, many times over.
And you gotta understand, this wasn't some far-off threat that only politicians worried about. Oh no, this fear seeped into everyday life, especially in America. People literally built bomb shelters in their backyards. Kids in school had to practice duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks. Imagine growing up with that constant, low-level hum of anxiety about nuclear war.
While the arms race was going on, another competition was heating up, the race to space. And in 1957, the Soviets delivered a massive shock to the world by launching Sputnik, the first satellite. America was stunned.
This kicked off a frantic race. The Soviets scored another big win, putting the first man into orbit. But the US set an audacious goal: to put a man on the moon. And in 1969, they did it, which for many signaled a victory in the space race.
So the Cold War wasn't just fought with technology. The whole planet became this giant chessboard where the US and the Soviet Union were the two master players, moving their pieces around, forming alliances, and fighting wars through others.
So the two sides formed massive military teams. The US and its allies in Western Europe created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact. The core idea for both was simple: an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
So while the war between the superpowers was cold, it got tragically hot all over the globe. These were the proxy wars. In places like Korea and Vietnam, Americans and Soviets never shot at each other directly. Instead, they supplied weapons, money, and support to opposite sides in devastating civil wars. And then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, the absolute closest the world ever came to a full-blown nuclear war. For 13 days, everyone held their breath.
Now, the fear of communism wasn't just focused outward, it turned inward, right here in the United States, creating a paranoid period we call the Red Scare. A congressional committee, HUAC, held these infamous hearings, trying to hunt down supposed communists in all walks of life. They famously went after Hollywood, blacklisting actors and writers, and creating this toxic atmosphere where just being accused could ruin your life. Okay, so after decades of living on a knife's edge, by the 1970s, people were just exhausted. This ushered in the final act of the Cold War, which started with a temporary cooling-off period before everything came crashing down. And that cooling-off period has a name: détente. It's a French word that just means relaxation. For a while in the 70s, the US and the Soviet Union actually tried to get along. They signed major treaties to limit their nuclear arsenals, like the SALT I Treaty. It was a huge step back from the brink.
But the real beginning of the end came with one man, Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, and he knew his country was in deep economic trouble. So he introduced two radical new policies. First was glasnost, which meant more political openness, more free speech. The second was perestroika, which was all about reforming the broken economy. He was trying to save the system, but he accidentally opened a Pandora's box that he couldn't close.
And this quote just perfectly captured the moment. In 1987, US President Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War divide, and issued this direct challenge. It became a rallying cry for freedom movements all across Eastern Europe.
And after that, the end came with stunning speed. In November 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall came down. People just swarmed it and started tearing it apart with their bare hands. It was an incredible moment. Just 2 years later, the mothership itself, the Soviet Union, formally voted itself out of existence. And just like that, the Cold War was over.
So we end with a final thought. The fight is over, but the ghost of the Cold War is still with us. Military alliances like NATO are more relevant than ever. The fear of nuclear weapons hasn't gone away. The political map of the world was largely drawn during those decades. The question for us is, how do we see those echoes playing out in the world today? It's something to really think about.